Om Namo Bhagavate Ramakrishnaya. What life has taught me. Swami Ranganathananda. Chapter 8. With the Marxist government in Czechoslovakia. I was on a 4-month lecture tour of 17 European countries in 1961, organized by the government of India. Czechoslovakia was under Stalinist communist regime in the 1961s. From Poland, I reached Prague on 19th of June 1961. I was received by Dr. Karminova Eva, Chief of Section, Czech Ministry of Education and Culture, Mr. Jaroslav. Though it is spelled as Jauris, it is pronounced as Jaroslav. Assistant to Karminova and Miss Yarmila Mastovska, who likes to be called by Sanskrit name Urmila, a student of Sanskrit and Hindi at Prague University, deputed by Czech government to be my interpreter during my stay in that country. I was treated as a guest by the Czech government but agreed to the request of the Indian ambassador Sri Bijoy Kumar Acharya that in Prague I would be staying with Sri Acharya. Next day I visited Czech government secretariat accompanied by Miss Yarmila Mastovska for an interview with Mr. Holubek, Chief of Foreign Relations Department, Czech Ministry of Cultural Affairs. Mr. Holubek told me that his department had drawn up for my 5-day stay in Czechoslovakia with 3 days in Prague and 2 in Bratislava. Government arranged for my visit to Bratislava, capital of Slovakia, which is situated on the majestic river, the Danube. Prague is the capital of Czechoslovakia and it is in the Bohemia region. It was one state at that time, though recently it has become divided into Czech and Slovak. When I asked how the word Bohemian got the meaning of impractical, visionary, etc. in the English language, he replied that it came from an earlier tribe by name Bojohem that had occupied this area. I was received at the airport by Mr. Herman Klako, Secretary of the Slovak Academy of Science. They took me by government car to Hotel Devin for my stay arranged by Czech government. The Danube flowed majestically a few yards away. In the University of Czechoslovakia, over 5,000 students were studying, of which 60% were girls. They studied Tagore and Vivekananda also. I spoke on Tagore at the request of the university. There was a discussion after the lecture. Yarmila translated my lecture on Tagore, which ended with the Gitanjali passage, beginning with, "Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high." This was followed by questions and answers. Returning to Prague on 21st June, I was taken to the Czech Society of International Relations. I was received by Dr. M. Krasa of the Oriental Institute, Prague, who knows Sanskrit and Hindi and who introduced me to several officers of the Czech government present there and who had also read Ramakrishna Vivekananda literature. In the evening, I addressed the staff of the Indian embassy at the Chancery when a few Czech people also were present. On the 22nd of June, Yarmila took me in the morning by state car to the Charles University for a 2-hour discussion with the staff of the philosophical faculty. The professors there spoke about the Marxist theory of everything being the result of material forces and productive relations, and human progress was to be achieved by the manipulation of these forces in the way set down in Marxism. I raised the question whether man could be made more moral, more social-minded, and less self-centered merely by the continued manipulation of the external environment, and whether the 44 years experience of Soviet Russia in this line could be said to verify this Marxist theory and hope. They were sincere enough to admit that verification was not forthcoming, and that modern communistic thought in Russia was realizing more and more that constant emphasis on mere material values would not help to achieve the communistic objective of human excellence, and that it needed greater emphasis on moral values. This gave me an opportunity to point out the importance of recognizing the inner world of man over and above his outer environment, and the need to educate and train him or her in his or her inner life over and above the control and manipulation of his or her external life by science and technology. The next hour and a half they listened to my Vedantic point of view with suitable quotations from Swami Vivekananda. They expressed admiration for Vivekananda's thought. I referred to the recent tightening of laws against antisocial tendencies and practices of a non-political nature in Soviet Russia, and the Russian Prime Minister Nikita Khrushchev's denunciation, as reported in the press, of the love of ease, of laziness, a tendency towards corrupt practices, and a general deviation from communist moral standards among a section of Soviet citizens who had accumulated some wealth. I said that man has to be educated into the moral life by making him or her aware that there is some deep value in him or her which is not the product or slave of material forces and conditions, which is a spark of the divine in the Vedantic language, which needs to be liberated from all obstructions, external or internal. The professors who had been keenly listening to my above exposition asked me what exactly was this inner world and its enrichment, apart from the cultural enrichment provided by the arts such as literature, music and painting, and the general pursuit of science. I added that it was too early to judge the strength and completeness of communistic ideology. The judgment is reserved for history, and the history of the ancient and recent past does not hold out any such promise for the future. The friends and the professors agreed that these views were highly progressive, but that the people of the West knew only the approach of the Christian or Judaic religion, but not that of India, and that there was an urgent need for the West to know the Indian view, which would help to correct and enrich Western thought. One of the professors asked me with some emphasis whether I thought the Czechoslovakian communism was rigid and dogmatic. I replied yes, and referred to Lenin's statement that communist countries must learn to cease to treat Marxism as sacred dogma. I addressed a meeting at the Indian Chancery at the request of the Indian ambassador and his wife, when about 70 people were present. About 30 were diplomats, who included the ambassadors of Yugoslavia, United Arab Republic, Sweden, Austria, Yemen, members of United Kingdom, and Polish embassies, and several Czech government officials. The subject was the appeal of Vedanta to modern man. The subject was the appeal of Vedanta to modern man. Cyclo-style copies of the speech in English were distributed by the government to the guests at the entrance earlier. Dr. Yuri Stepanovsky of the Institute for International Economics and Politics expressed appreciation for the ideas and viewpoints of the Vedanta, but insisted that in communist countries, where the English word religion had a bad odor associated with it, and the communist mind is allergic to it, it would be better to call it philosophy of life. I concurred with him. I was glad to meet there Count Heinrich Kallis, Austrian ambassador, and his wife, because I was the guest of his brother Rudolf Kallis and his wife Mrs. Leah Kallis in Vienna. The whole family here and at Vienna had become drawn to Vedanta. On 23rd June, I went to the house of engineer Ari Vasily. At Vasily's house, a group of 5 Czech admirers of Vedanta had assembled, including Mr. Václav Čech. This group studied Vedanta and held weekly meetings for study and meditation in the members' houses. They were devoted to Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, and I talked to them a few minutes on Vedanta and Sri Ramakrishna. Later, I reached the house of Miss Helen Dvořák. It is spelled as D-V-O-R-A-K, but pronounced as Dvořák. She is the 80-and-odd-year-old sister of the well-known Czech painter, the late Mr. Frank Dvořák. F-R-A-N-K-D-V-O-R-A-K, but pronounced as Dvořák, Frank Dvořák, whose portrait of Sri Ramakrishna brings him into close communion with all devotees of Sri Ramakrishna. Helena and her younger sister, Mary Ryjakova, who lived in the studio of the late brother, spoke to me about the late brother and his devotion to Sri Ramakrishna and Sarada Devi, the Holy Mother. Frank Dvořák and Helena were in Chicago during the Parliament of Religions of 1893. He had a ticket for the Parliament but could not attend it on the day Swami Vivekananda spoke, due to a painting job on hand. He regretted for this very much when, a few years later, he met Swami Abhedananda in New York and later in London and learnt about Vivekananda and his great master Sri Ramakrishna. In the meantime, he had painted Sri Ramakrishna from an experience of a vision, which painting he produced before Abhedananda, when the latter showed him a photo of Sri Ramakrishna. It is the best portrait of Sri Ramakrishna so far available, which adorns the front cover page of My Master, Advaita Ashrama publication of Swami Vivekananda's lecture on Sri Ramakrishna in London and New York. He later painted a similar portrait of the Holy Mother also. Helena showed me a girva or colored dress used by Swami Vivekananda, which she had received as a present from the late Miss MacLeod, an American disciple and friend of Vivekananda, and which she treasured with great devotion. I saw with her a letter of Abhedananda received by her brother, who treated Abhedananda as his guru. Helena's room was full of Vivekananda's and Sarada Devi's photos. Frank Dvořák had passed away in 1927. She showed me a letter of Swami Abhedananda dated March 16, 1928, in which he thanked her for sending him her brother's painting of the Holy Mother. She showed me also a half-column cutting of the Calcutta Dailies, forward of March 16, 1928, and Amrita Bazar Patrika of March 15, 1928, in which this gift had been narrated and thanked for. Frank Dvořák was a Czech from Prague. In the Ramakrishna Mission books, he was often referred to as an Austrian from Vienna. This is due to the inclusion of Czechoslovakia in the pre-war 1914 to 1918, in the pre-war First World War Austrian Empire. Rabindranath Tagore had visited Frank Dvořák in his studio in 1921 and again in 1926. I was shown a group photo taken on the first occasion, in which are Dvořák, Tagore, and the famous Prague Indologist, the late Professor Lesny. The same evening, they took me to the Narrated Museum Hall for my main public lecture in Prague. It was organized by the Czech Ministry of Culture, and the subject they had chosen was spiritual life of the Indian people. An eager and enthusiastic audience of about 250 people had filled the hall. A large number of them were youths, and a good number of them were government officials and professors, and about 50 of them had to stand for all the 165 minutes of the lecture and discussion. A Czech translation of the lecture had been distributed by the Czech government to the audience at the entrance. 1 hour lecture was followed by a barrage of questions. I was very much impressed with the tremendous interest taken by the people in Prague in the spiritual and philosophical thought of India. On the 24th June, I was taken by Yarmila to the government secretariat to make a farewell call on the cultural ministry. Mr. Mojmir Hudek and a few other officials of the Czech ministry. They asked me whether I had been satisfied with what they had done for my visit. I expressed my thanks for all they had done. I left Prague for Zurich that day. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpana.